There are moments when you realize that the difference between living and dying is not a grand philosophical decision, but something as small and unexpected as a poster on a grocery store bulletin board. And for Marcus Webb, a 32-year-old Army Ranger who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, but couldn't survive the silence of his own apartment, that moment came on a Tuesday in November when he stood in his kitchen with a loaded gun on the table and rain hammering against the window like accusations he couldn't answer, like questions he had stopped trying to explain to therapists, who nodded and took notes but never understood what it meant to hold someone's hand while they died and know that all your training and all your desperate prayers meant nothing against the physics of shrapnel and the mathematics of blood loss. He had written the notes, had organized his bills, had done all the administrative tasks that dying requires in the modern world, and he sat there for 3 hours while the apartment grew cold because he had stopped paying the heating bill 2 months ago, stopped caring about tomorrow or comfort or anything, except the growing certainty that the world would be cleaner without him in it, that his existence was a kind of pollution, a stain that needed to be removed. But there was one image his mind kept returning to with the persistence of a splinter working deeper into skin, and it was that poster he had seen that morning at the grocery store, advertising the county animal shelter's final adoption event before closing for renovations. And something about that word final, something about last chances and doors closing forever, had lodged itself in his consciousness and refused to leave even though he told himself it was irrelevant, told himself that nothing mattered anymore because he had already made his decision. He told himself it was procrastination, told himself he was delaying the inevitable. But something in that word final kept pulling at him like a fishhook caught in flesh. And he put the gun in the drawer and drove through freezing rain to the shelter. And when he walked through the doors 17 minutes before closing time, the girl at the front desk looked up with an expression that shifted from annoyance at a last-minute customer to concern to something like recognition, as if she could see the death sitting on his shoulders like a familiar pet, as if she knew exactly why someone would show up to an animal shelter in the final minutes before closing on a night when the weather suggested staying home. Asterisk. If you have ever stood where Marcus stood, if you have ever felt the weight of existing become so unbearable that non-existence seems like the only rational solution, subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened in the next 12 hours will challenge everything you think you know about salvation and purpose and the mysterious ways that life intervenes when we have given up on it entirely. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances that arrive in the strangest forms. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from. Because this story belongs to everyone who has ever needed saving and found it in the most unexpected place. The shelter smelled like wet dog and disinfectant and something else. Something desperate and resigned. The smell of creatures waiting to be chosen or forgotten. And Marcus walked past the cages of barking dogs, who threw themselves against the chain link with the enthusiasm of the condemned begging for clemency. And he felt nothing, felt only the familiar numbness that had replaced every other emotion in the 2 years since he came home from Kandahar, carrying invisible wounds that the VA kept insisting weren't real because they couldn't be measured on their forms or treated with their protocols. Wounds that didn't show up on x-rays or blood tests, but that shaped every moment of every day with the weight of ghosts and the texture of shame. Asterisk. He was about to leave, was about to walk back out into the rain and return to his apartment and the gun that was waiting with infinite patience, when he heard a sound that stopped him completely. A hiss so low and sustained and filled with such concentrated rage that Marcus turned toward it the way a combat veteran turns toward gunfire, with instinct rather than thought, with muscles remembering what the conscious mind tries to forget. And in the last cage in the back corner, in a space so small it seemed designed for punishment rather than shelter, there was a cat, and it was the ugliest cat Marcus had ever seen. its fur patchy and matted in ways that suggested neglect or illness or both. One ear torn nearly in half, its left eye sealed shut with scar tissue that spoke of violence survived. And it was pressed against the back of the cage with its remaining eye fixed on Marcus with an intensity that felt almost violent, almost accusatory. Above the cage was a sign written in the cheerful handwriting of someone trying to make the best of a bad situation. And it read Apollo, male, 8 years old. Unadoptable due to aggression and behavioral issues. Scheduled for euthanasia November 15th. And today was November 14th, and Marcus stood there doing the math, realizing that this creature had approximately 15 hours left to live. That someone had already decided his fate, had already determined that he was beyond saving, beyond redemption, beyond the possibility of change. The shelter worker appeared beside Marcus, a tired woman in her 50s whose name tag read Jennifer. And she launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech, explaining in a voice that suggested she had given up expecting different outcomes that Apollo had been at the shelter for 11 months, had been brought in after his elderly owner died alone in an apartment where nobody found him for 3 days, had bitten 3 potential adopters hard, enough to require medical attention, and 2 staff members who were just trying to feed him, had been evaluated by 3 different animal behaviorists, who all agreed that he was too traumatized to ever trust humans again, that his aggression was not something that could be trained away or medicated into submission, and that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. he would be humanely euthanized because they simply didn't have the resources to keep housing an animal that no one would ever want. Marcus looked at the cat, and the cat looked at Marcus, and something passed between them. Some recognition that existed beyond language or species. Some understanding that they were both creatures that had been deemed unsuitable for the world they found themselves in. Both carrying damage that couldn't be fixed by the usual methods. Both scheduled for their own forms of euthanasia, whether administered by injection or by bullet. And Marcus heard himself say words that surprised him even as he spoke them. Words that came from some part of himself he thought had died in that poppy field outside Kandahar when his best friend Rodriguez bled out in his arms. While Marcus tried to plug holes that were too big to plug and whispered lies about medevac helicopters that were never coming. And he said, "I'll take him." Jennifer stared at Marcus as if he had spoken in a language she didn't understand, her mouth opening and closing like someone trying to formulate an argument against obvious insanity. And then she launched into a different speech, this one clearly written by lawyers. A long explanation about how the shelter could not be held responsible for any injuries or property damage. How Apollo had drawn blood from everyone who had tried to handle him. How the cat would require extensive behavioral modification and possibly medication, and definitely more patience than any reasonable person possessed. And Marcus listened to all of this with the expression of someone listening to instructions for an exam they had no intention of taking. He signed the papers that released the shelter from all liability. Signed away his right to sue or complain or return the animal. Paid the adoption fee with a credit card he knew would never be paid off because dead men don't accumulate debt. And Jennifer disappeared into the back room and returned wearing thick leather gloves that went up to her elbows and carrying a plastic cat carrier that shook with the force of the rage contained inside it. And she set it down with visible relief and said good luck in a tone that suggested she thought Marcus would need considerably more than luck. And Marcus picked up the carrier and felt it vibrate with hissing and the thump of paws hitting plastic. And he carried this furious broken creature out into the November sleet. When he pulled into his apartment parking lot, he noticed something strange. Noticed that the building looked different somehow. Looked less like a stage set for an ending and more like a place where things might still happen, might still matter. And he carried the shaking carrier up the stairs and into his living room, and set it down and opened the door and stepped back and waited. And for 10 minutes nothing happened, and then slowly, With the caution of a soldier clearing a room that might contain threats, Apollo emerged. The cat pressed low to the ground with his one good eye scanning for danger. Muscles coiled and ready to bolt or attack, and Marcus sat down on the floor. Sat down slowly so as not to trigger the cat's flight response. And he stayed there for an hour while Apollo remained frozen near the carrier. And Marcus found himself talking, found himself saying things he had never said out loud to anyone. Telling this damaged animal about Rodriguez and the IED that turned their convoy into a slaughterhouse, and the way time moved differently in combat. Slowed down so you could see every detail of people dying, could count their last breaths, could memorize the exact shade of blood on sand. He talked about coming home to a country that thanked him for his service with the mechanical enthusiasm of people reciting scripts they didn't believe. Talked about how nobody wanted to hear what that service actually entailed. Didn't want to know about the things he had done or seen or failed to prevent. Talked about the nightmares that arrived every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. with the regularity of a shift change. Talked about the VA appointments where bored doctors prescribed pills that made him feel like he was watching his own life through fogged glass. And he talked about the gun in the drawer and the plan he had made and the relief he felt knowing it would all be over soon. Apollo listened, or at least didn't leave. And as Marcus talked, the cat began to move, began to edge closer with a slowness that suggested he was crossing vast distance rather than a few feet of carpet. And by the time Marcus stopped talking, by the time his voice gave out from saying things he had kept locked inside for 2 years, Apollo was close enough that Marcus could see the scars covering his body, could see the evidence of trauma written in missing fur and torn skin, and the way he held himself, like someone expecting the next blow to arrive at any moment. Marcus reached out his hand slowly, reached out the way you reach towards something that might explode. And Apollo's remaining eye tracked the movement with predatory focus. And when Marcus's fingers were 6 inches from the cat's head, Apollo lunged forward and bit him. Bit him hard enough to break skin and draw blood. And Marcus pulled back his hand and looked at the puncture wounds welling red and felt something that might have been the beginning of laughter. Felt the absurdity of surviving firefights and roadside bombs, only to be attacked by a rescue cat in his own living room. He wrapped his hand in a kitchen towel and said out loud, "Well, I guess we're both pretty messed up." Said it to a cat who couldn't understand the words, but might understand the tone. The resignation mixed with something that might have been recognition or acceptance, or possibly the beginning of something that could eventually become trust if given enough time and patience and the willingness to accept that healing doesn't happen in straight lines, but in circles and spirals, and sometimes not at all. He fell asleep on the floor without meaning to. Fell asleep because his body finally gave in to an exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. And he woke at 3:17 a.m. the way he always did. Woke with his heart racing and his hands reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Woke into the familiar nightmare where he was back in the convoy and Rodriguez was bleeding and the medevac was never coming. But this time something was different. This time there was a weight on his chest. A warm, heavy presence that shouldn't be there. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw Apollo curled on his sternum. Saw the cat's one good eye open and watching him with an intensity that felt almost like understanding. And there was purring. Deep rumbling vibration that seemed to travel through Marcus's ribs and into the space where his heart was supposed to be. And Marcus lifted his hand slowly, expecting the cat to bolt or attack, but Apollo didn't move, just continued purring and watching. And Marcus touched the matted fur gently, and Apollo leaned into the contact with a pressure that felt like trust or possibly just exhaustion. Marcus lay there in the darkness with this broken animal on his chest and felt something crack open inside him. Felt some wall that he had built to survive the unsurvivable begin to crumble. And he cried then, cried in a way he hadn't cried since Rodriguez died. Cried in a way that felt like something essential leaving his body. And Apollo stayed there through all of it, vibrating with that impossible purr, And when Marcus finally stopped, when the crying gave way to a kind of emptiness that felt clean rather than hollow, he looked at the cat and said thank you. Said it to an animal that couldn't understand the words, but seemed to understand everything that mattered beneath them. The next morning Marcus woke on the floor with Apollo still on his chest. Woke to sunlight coming through windows he usually kept covered. And his first thought was not about the gun in the drawer, but about whether he had cat food. And he realized with something like surprise that he was hungry. Was actually hungry for the first time in months. And this small biological fact felt like a revelation. Felt like evidence that his body was still invested in survival, even when his mind had given up. He drove to the pet store and bought cat food and a litter box and toys that he wasn't sure Apollo would use and a brush for the matted fur. And when he returned to the apartment, Apollo was sitting in the exact spot where Marcus had left him. As if he too was testing this new arrangement. Testing whether Marcus would return or disappear the way everyone else in his life had disappeared. And when Marcus walked through the door, Apollo's one good eye tracked him with an expression that might have been relief, or might have been suspicion, or might have been both. The days that followed had a rhythm that Marcus didn't recognize at first. A rhythm built around feeding times and litter box cleaning and the slow, patient work of earning Apollo's trust. And Marcus found that caring for this damaged animal required him to establish routines. Required him to get up at specific times and buy groceries and think about tomorrow in a way he hadn't thought about tomorrow in 2 years. And the gun stayed in the drawer, stayed there gathering dust while Marcus's days filled with the mundane tasks of keeping himself and Apollo alive. 6 months later at a routine VA appointment, the doctor looked at Marcus and said something's different. Said it with the surprise of someone who hadn't expected to see Marcus alive. And Marcus tried to explain about Apollo, but couldn't find the words that would make sense to someone who had never needed saving by something they were supposed to save. And a year after the adoption, Marcus started volunteering at the shelter helping Jennifer with the animals that other people had given up on. And he found that he was good at it, found that his patience with Apollo had taught him patience with other damaged creatures. Apollo is 5 now, is older and calmer, but still unpredictable. Still has days when he wants nothing to do with Marcus and days when he follows him from room to room as if afraid Marcus might disappear. And Marcus is 37 now, is still carrying Rodriguez with him, but carrying him differently. Carrying him as a memory rather than a wound. And the gun is still in the drawer, but it's been so long since Marcus thought about it that he sometimes forgets it's there. And if this story moved you, if you have ever been saved by something you thought you were saving, subscribe to this channel for more stories about the mysterious ways that life intervenes. Hit that like button if you believe broken things can heal each other. And leave a comment sharing a moment when an animal changed your life, because these stories matter. These connections remind us that even in our darkest moments when we have given up on ourselves, sometimes the universe sends exactly what we need in exactly the form we need it.